Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you everybody for coming. This is an interesting and exciting presentation. I've known Dr. Ayهم for, I don't know, 10 years now, maybe. And we have worked together in more than one capacity. And I've known about this book for a while since he started working on it. So I was quite excited when the book was finished and I could see the final product. Dr. Ayهم has been working on refugees and refugee camps for a while now. He's initially a trained architect and an urban planner. He was trained in Syria. He grew up in Homs. In 2001, and just before the war, he graduated. And since he's a Palestinian Jordanian, he came to Jordan. He worked for a year. And then he embarked on his academic journey. First he went to Cairo and Stuttgart, and he had a double master degree. Stuttgart University and Ain Shams University, specializing in integrated urbanism and sustainable design. And then he moved to Berlin, and he finished his PhD in the Technical University there. He has several publications on refugee camps and refugees, either in Jordan or Germany. We worked together, actually the first time we met, we were working together on a workshop for students in, I think, Tلبية or Gaza camp, Jarash Gaza camp, which was approximately 8 years ago. Yeah, time flies. We're not that old. And it was an interesting project that was funded by GIZ, and we coordinated with UNRWA so that the results of the work were actually quite relevant to the actors and the stakeholders, where the students actually worked with the local community to develop sustainable solutions. He also came to another workshop. We worked in Husn camp, and during that time he was also working on Za'atari camp. So he started working on Za'atari quite a while, and I would say he's one of the foremost experts on Za'atari because he followed up the camp since the initial stages. He started working even before they created that camp, in the early stages when it was a bit messy and there was no designated space. Now professionally he has worked, as I said, with UNRWA, GIZ. Also, he had given seminars in urban studies for students in the US, Germany, and Oman. He will soon be starting a lectureship position as assistant professor in architecture and urban planning at the German University in Cairo. And good luck. I'm sure he will do more research and interesting papers. He has also created or curated several exhibits showcasing the resilience of refugees in camps, and has co-edited the first book specialized on architecture of the camps in the Middle East. As you may know, camps have often been studied from a social perspective, developmental sometimes perspective, health. You'll find a lot of papers on health, but especially for Jordan, very little is available on the architecture. So this is going to be an important addition to the literature available on the built environment in camps. And I was honored to share a small piece about some of the Palestinian camps I worked with. He also recently co-directed a short film on the architecture of refugee camps in Berlin. The film was titled 13 Square Meters, and that title actually depicts the size of the container in which the refugees are sheltered. The film was featured in many film festivals around the world and has received the first prize award at the London Architecture Film Festival last year. Ayهم was a visiting fellow at the Refugee Studies Center in Oxford and the Collaborative Research Center Refiguration integration of space in Berlin. And currently, he is doing a postdoctoral research on Syrian refugees in Amman with IFPU and CNRS in France. I hope you will enjoy this presentation. We will first ask Dr. Ayhem to give us a short overview of the book, and then I will conduct informal discussion about some of the main ideas, and of course we will later open the floor for any inquiries or comments. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima, for the generous introduction. In this book, first I should start by thanking many people who actually contributed to making this book. I want to say thank you to Dr. Lina Gribat, who convinced me to transform my PhD into a book. I want to thank Philip Misselbitz also for allowing me to be part of a bigger research project back then in Berlin called Architectures of Asylum. TU Berlin Publication Funds for making this book possible, for making it also available online. You can download it, it's open access. Also colleagues, Veronica Zarikova, who worked with me, she was my student assistant, she helped me a lot by making all my messy drawings very nice, and as you will see later. I want to thank also, of course, Dr. Fatima Namri. I still remember when I first started the field work in 2014, I made this phone call. I was really fascinated by her work on UNRWA and her experience as an architect in Palestinian refugee camps. I need to thank also the IFPO team, with whom I worked a lot in Amman, especially Kamel Dubai. And Dar Sunun, of course, Ahmed and Luma, for giving us this amazing space to present the book. And of course, I have to thank Quisco, the NGO that allowed me to enter the camp. First and foremost, Syrian refugees who opened their doors for me and really embraced me, make me feel at home when I was feeling so much out of place. To make this brief, I'm trying to make this as brief as possible. So I will first try to explain what is my relation to this book, and then I will explain a little bit of the methodology and why this book is timely, why this book is important at this moment of time. So this is the book. You can have actually a few copies. I'm sorry that I have only 11 copies at the desk. You can ask for if you want more. There's a list where you can put your name, and I can try to provide copies next month.
And they can download it.
And they can you can download it online. Yes, it's an open access book. So I will read a little bit of the introduction of the book, just to kind of position myself in relation to why this book came to happen, why I wrote this book. So this is not just another book about Za'atari camp or the Syrian refugee crisis. This is also not a text by another Westerner, often white, male scholar studying or speaking on behalf of refugees. It's a personal account of how displacement as an individual experience, exile as an intellectual state of being, and a passion for science and discovery all intertwine. Many scholars speak about home and homemaking. Increasingly today in the context of refugees and displaced populations. Many Western scholars, some of them are really well known, like Bourdieu or Lévi-Strauss, Rapaport, have ethnographically examined the condition in which communities are considered different or primitive, quote unquote, primitive live. Yet how many of these writers have actually endured displacement and can speak about the loss of home from a personal experience? When is the time for those who have experienced the loss of home, and by that I particularly mean displaced scholars from the global south, to narrate their experience and explain, based on their positionality, what home means? This is for me a very important starting point for this book, because while writing this book, there was lots of discussion. There was like a euphoria of people speaking about homemaking or homing for refugees, whereas little of them have actually experienced what displacement can do to people. How does it really affect people? And for me personally, having to leave what used to be Homs, which is Homs in Syria, through the process of research, I discovered that I was also writing about myself. I was also trying to discover how I dwell, how I settle in a certain place. One of the examples here I mentioned, after I finished the master studies, I really had a little attention to how important it is to have a space of lodging, your own dwelling space. And I had to sleep for a few nights in the working room where I discovered that I don't have actually a place to sit in. So I was sleeping in the room, really stowing my luggage under the table and hoping that the lady who was cleaning not recognize me in the morning. So the question about, so when I was doing this research, I ended up with these piles of papers about Za'atari camp, lots of sketches, lots of things about how people dwell. And at TU Berlin, people ask me, so you're looking at homemaking, right? This is what you're researching about. And I was really bothered because I'm not sure if people living in tent call this really home. And there was a distinction in Arabic. In Arabic we call things bait. This is the bait. It somehow has this kind of physical and emotional connection at the same time. Whereas in English literature, home takes you in a certain direction. It's very emotional, very imaginative, very individual. It also relates to the home as a homeland, as the father's land or mother's land. And also it's different from the physical home. So I was happy to come across the writings of Martin Heidegger, who was a German philosopher who back then also experienced sort of displacement during World War II, and wrote about home as a state of being. We exist, and then consequently we have to dwell. This is not a choice. As you see here, I was doing lots of interviews with refugees. I was doing lots of mapping. This is a methodology I kind of developed. I call it co-mapping. And co-mapping is a way of trying to draw together with the interviewee how they appropriated their home. I'm gonna read here quickly. So generally speaking, co-mapping is a research method that relies on the researcher's ability to first visualize and then illustrate a space while it's being described by the interviewee. The paper placed in front of the researcher and the interviewee becomes a mean of co-production, a canvas for articulating ideas, visualizing relationships, and examining arrangements and compositions of space. Of course, these kind of series of mappings were combined with mental maps and with sketches. Some of them I had to really do quickly, while people didn't really allow me to make photos like the one on the left here and this down. And of course, people were showing me around, trying to tell me the stories of how they make the place. Many people were very proud about when they start to speak about it. They were like, there was nothing here when we came here. There was nothing here. This is all our. So they were really emphasizing their creativity and their production. This is our production. They were proud about what they have produced. Now, why this book is timely? We speak about shelter, we speak about refugee camps, but I think there's little attention to how many people are still living in tents and in shelters. Today in Syria, the northern region of Syria hosts about 1,400 refugee camps today still. And there's about 800,000 people living in tents according to OCHA report that was published recently. So we're living in a region that is, in a turmoil region that's living in tents is not far away from anybody. So this is the book trying to kind of argue that dwelling is a concept that is inseparable from any shelter, from any camp. And it is interesting to look at this dynamics when looking at Za'atari, right? So here we have the camp that has grew over the years, first starting like a few tents, as you can see here, and then evolving into one of the big refugee camps in the world. But the interesting moment happened in December 2012 when the UNHCR, the management of the camp, wanted to plan and to introduce humanitarian planning to the camp. Now, how do we design a refugee camp? There are regulations of how we can do that. So there's this handbook for emergencies that tell the site planners, the technocrats, how they have to organize the space, what kind of closed, there's this kind of distinction between closed and open space. There is an amount for each person. In Za'atari camp, a family of 5 people were offered a tent or a caravan, which is a new type of shelter that was brought later onto the camp. And then you have the communal latrines and communal kitchens, of course, and communal water tanks. Now the result was, as you can see here, kind of defragmented dwelling space, right? It's dwellings, you know, the houses where we live are very complex, very multifunctional, very dynamic. And this was broken down into pieces, right? In this kind of arrangement of spaces that really try to separate functions, if you want, very kind of modernist planning approach, something that reminds us of Le Corbusier's maybe ideas of the city to separate, you know, functions. This is the living area, this is the kitchen, this is the toilet, this is where you do things. And if you look at this holistically, this looks like a plan of a house, right? A plan of a dwelling where this can be, for instance, a living room, this is a sleeping room, this is a toilet, this is a kitchen. But the problem is this is made for thousands of people to inhabit. This is made for thousands of people to be accommodated in this kind of arrangement. Now, the main contribution of this book is that it brings a new theory, a new idea that dwelling is a force that breaks down the camp. It's introducing something that I call dismantling and reassembling. So by having this need to dwell, this kind of urgency to dwell, people start to slowly, you know, dismantle all the structure of the camp. And as you can see here, compose something that's newly different, that's completely different from what used to be. Now I will read a little bit of what I wrote here. So according to the Cambridge English Dictionary, the word dismantling means, quote unquote, the process of taking a machine apart into separate pieces. And this is important to think of the camp as a machine here, as a machine of living. Also something similar of what Le Corbusier called the house, a machine for living. For one thing, it entails the subversion of imposed power relations, which can be seen in many ways. Refugees have replanned, reused, and rearranged the architectural elements used in planning the camp. Second, it includes the fragmentation and dissolving of other structures imposed on refugees, whether physical or metaphysical, such as physical aspects, you know, the shelter, or other aspects like economy. So you can see here on the left, this is a communal infrastructure that was built for refugees at the early stages, and it's completely dismantled. People were taking parts of the communal infrastructure and adding them to their dwelling, you know, adding them to their home. You know, they said, we need a toilet, we need a step here, we need, you know, all this kind of stuff. So they were like really, the kind of communal facilities in the camp were dissolving. Similarly, also economy, you know, the refugees receive, let's say, funds each month that they have to spend in markets or non-food items. But these were traded, they were circulating in the camp, a new kind of economy emerged. This also applies to the architecture of the camp. So as you see here, the caravan, which is a very standardized unit. Of course, it was donated by many people, many countries, if you want, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, mostly Gulf countries. They were dismantled by refugees and rearranged differently, which is again captures the idea of, you know, dismantling and reassembling the camp or the shelter for the purpose of dwelling. People were, for example, if you see on the top right, this is a small living room that people, you know, because things were put in place, they had to cut and then they had to push, you know, in place to kind of expand the living area. Or people, you know, have to move parts of the caravan, like a door, placing it here, adding a toilet, or creating a wall, extra wall to prevent view from the neighbors looking into their house. So this is basically the result of dismantling and reassembling, right? The basic unit of the shelter and the camp somehow completely dissolved, and new forms of structures of built environment emerged. As you can see here, some of them are very complex, you know, like the example on the right. Some of them are more like sporadic and you know, punctual in their arrangement. So in this kind of process, I try to underline two main dynamics that seems to have influenced this process. So the first one is social, so social dynamics of reassembling. These can be understood as patterns in which people try to create this kind of new space. And also there are these kind of material dynamics of reassembling, which I will explain later. So here you can see people were basically very creative. They were creating all kinds of dwellings from all types of materials available in the camp. Now, in the book, I give three detailed examples of how this kind of transformation happened, right? From the very basic unit, from the shelter, into something very complex, which is the dwelling. Three main issues I try to kind of underline here, which is first is the visual privacy. So the need for visual privacy is something very important within the arrangement of the shelter, because you can imagine a family of 5 people can be asked to live in one container room, which is almost impossible. You know, people ask, okay, so how can we change clothes in front of each other? You know, the gender aspect, which might have influenced, you know, the production of Islamic cities, because, you know, I rely here on Janet Abul-Lughd writings that this kind of male and female turf produced this kind of social spaces that we can see in the old city. For example, if you see here, example on the left, this is a cluster that was built by many families who basically produced this. They introduced the social space into the camp, which was not there. You know, the kind of semi-public space, a semi-private space, private space, etc. All these kind of nuances of social spaces suddenly started to emerge, and they appeared within the camp. Another social dynamic on the right, you can see it, is family relations, right? I mean, the interesting part about this kind of dwelling, that it allows the changes within the family to manifest spatially, because issues like departure, arrival, marriage, divorce, death, burn, you know, like all these kind of things somehow have a spatial implications. And the interesting part is the idea of this kind of transformation from shelter to dwelling is not linear and is not just one way. It goes in all ways. You know, if you see here a tent that was inhabited by, you know, a widowed mother and her daughter, and how things evolved and eventually ended up with one cluster or one or two baits instead of many. The third social dynamic that I'm underlying here is knowledge. And by knowledge, I mean how people, you know, approach issues like culture or memory. I use knowledge as a catalyst for these very heavy, you know, notions. Because at the beginning, when people were arriving to the camp, many people said, okay, yeah, Syrian refugees are reproducing, you know, the traditional Syrian house. But the question is this really true? I mean, is this really what's happening? What I'm trying to argue here is that people use their knowledge, their kind of previous, this kind of subconscious knowledge about how they used to live. For example, this guy used to live in an old house in Damascus. He used elements from it to kind of create a new arrangement. So what's being underlined here, that this kind of new dwelling is actually hybrid, is new, is something that combines what's known and what's currently faced. There are people also who try to, you know, formulate new identities with these kind of dwellings, such as bringing, if you were a city dweller, you're bringing, you know, sofas inside a very small caravan, which I thought was fascinating, or Bedouins or nomads trying to kind of use tents or kind of canvas as a way of construction, which was perceived by the others as different or unusual. So all these kind of dynamics played a role in how refugees reassembled their dwellings. Now the material dynamics has a lot to do with architecture, with economics, and with politics. So here you can see that the caravan was actually transformed from a donated unit into a commodity. So people were actually selling and buying caravans. There was actually a market in which these prices change over time, almost like a stock market. showing that the caravan was very, very essential for creating these dwellings and trying to respond to each family's need. Also, refugees became knowers of how to dismantle the caravan, how to, it's different sizes, pieces, how they can be assembled together in a newly different arrangement, and how much it costs. For example, 3,000 JD, 6,000. So people became masters of their own environment. The last dynamic that relates to materials is probably the temporariness, which is muaqqatiyya in Arabic. So people were trying to, I actually have to apologize that this is not in Arabic because the book is in English, so maybe next talk can be Arabic. And I wanted to have, be more inclusive. So the kind of temporariness aspect is in the ways that these materials gain a political dimension when they are put in the camp. So I remember here a discussion that happened with colleagues from an English NGO I was working with, and they wanted to build a permanent kind of rammed earth structure in Azraq camp. And I remember the awkwardness of the discussion with the managers, they were trying to convince them that it's okay to build with rammed earth and this is not permanent, and the guys was sweating. And so so people understood that these materials have a political dimension. So what happened is that they were trying to arrange these elements to kind of show the dwelling as something still temporary. We have tents, we have things, but inside they managed to use materials like cement or concrete blocks, which are eventually banned. They are not allowed to be used in the camp. And you can see here that people even use the caravan. This is like a side of one of the caravans to used as a roof. So people got very creative about how they make things. So to kind of wrap this up, I'm bringing in this kind of emphasizing this transformation from shelter to dwelling. I'm bringing attention to the role of appropriation. I'm going to read here. So when shelters are appropriated, new spaces emerge, precisely hybrid spaces that stand somewhere between the shelter, its original layout and clean design, and the dwelling with its personalized space and its multifunctional use. The transition from shelter to dwellings should therefore not be understood as a complete linear or static transformation. Instead, it represents a form of individualized journey and a process in which the gap between the shelter and the dwelling is sought to be bridged. The result is always hybrid and fragile, making the boundaries between the shelter and the dwelling in constant flux. What is also need to be understood here, that every attempt to appropriate the shelter is an attempt to dwell and consequently to resist the disciplinary apparatus of the camp. This is what makes these appropriations very valuable and important. Each small appropriation holds the key to understand the tension between what is a camp and what refugees' needs are. To appropriate in a refugee camp is to practice politics in its most explicit form to bridge the gap between the shelter and the dwelling. As you can see here, these kind of new environments emerged, as I said, combining all types of social spaces, of the politics of the materiality, and all these kind of dynamics, creating this kind of scene of construction. Finally, I want to say that this book tells the story of a camp that has emerged in the desert up in the northern part of Jordan. None of its current dwellers ever imagined being exiled from what once used to be a home and finding themselves striving to inhabit a tent or a caravan in a temporary space and for an unforeseeable period of time. What this book does is to narrate the story of its dwellers, exposing to the world their resilience and strength. What was first an empty tent or caravan has become a vibrant space of expression of being in a certain space and time, a space in which bits and pieces of the camp were put together to create remnants of what used to be and what could be. And here, the result is a piece of art, and the refugee dweller is the artist. Syrians in this camp and many others, including those who have settled in new cities and countries around the world, struggle to overcome the trauma of loss and hardships of displacement. It is within this book that their experience is honored Refugees are always and will ever forever be dwellers, and camps and shelters will consequently always dissolve, if not entirely, at least they will be dismantled and reassembled. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ayhem. Can you hear me well? Okay. I'm going to offer some reflections, and probably these reflections can expand some of the ideas and also open doors for a discussion with the floor later on. And one of the first things that actually drew my attention is the significance of the author stance or the researcher stance. How different can be achieved in the results, mainly because the author or the researcher actually is someone from within the same community in a way. So he's not an outsider looking at refugees and looking at what's happening. But I was quite impressed by how you constantly referenced your personal experience in the book. And you are maybe refugee to the power two in a way. So originally Palestinian family, Jordanian, but then again, you became a refugee again because you lived in Syria and had to come back. So you have these layers of experience as a displaced person and as a refugee. And it actually somehow reminded me of Edward Said's book, Out of Place, because there was a lot of echo when you were discussing how you felt that you needed a place to dwell, and how you couldn't, even though some researchers wanted to identify what the refugees were doing as homemaking, you could understand that this is not homemaking, and what's happening is dwelling. And you could see that because that's something you see from within, that's your own experience. I wanted to highlight what you think of this. Maybe we can call it more of a naturalistic research approach, where you're actually part of the research and not from the outside.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Fatima, for the question. I mean, I think it's at this period of time. I mean, it's important that researchers from the global south really speak up about all these kind of experiences we have endured. I think one of the main things that really pushed me to kind of write this is the fact that we feel, you know, intimidated by all the huge production of knowledge in the West. You know, we feel very intimidated. We feel that our experiences don't really count. We have to kind of go align with whatever is being said by others. And I think what I was trying to do here is to say, actually, no, we can say what we want to say, and this is how I felt at that moment. This is what I think is, and I thought this kind of emotional also part, and maybe psychological, is part of this research. I cannot simply assume that because I'm a scientist, I can just simply say, oh yeah, I have to separate this and just be producing data. I think we need to kind of combine this kind of artistic, emotional, you know, our state of being within the research as part of this research. And I think you know, being displaced from Syria, as we said, had affected me in many ways that I didn't really recognize until later. I was like, okay, I'm actually doing this research, but I'm actually also myself enduring sort of displacement that I have never spoken about in public or anywhere. So I wanted to kind of like really just say for anyone who's doing research or and the, you know, people from the global south, especially in universities in the West, that they, you know, they can actually speak up and be more sincere and actually not afraid of saying how they feel within the academic context.
Another issue that came to my mind as I was reading, and this is something probably I share, but I would like to hear maybe your reply or your response. I often discuss, you know, as researchers, we view the camp as a disciplinary space, or a space where people are more treated as objects. And research often talks about the refugee, bare life. But when you talk to people in the field, and I've done that a couple of times, and you discuss the camp in that regard as a disciplinary space, there is rejection to the notion. And often they feel that we are sitting in ivory towers and theorizing, but down to earth, the refugees are not just one group, they are a variety of individuals with different agendas, different abilities. Some of them are more vulnerable than others. And to protect the more vulnerable, you have to have a disciplinary system. And they often relate that to the system that exists anyway in urban settings. So we are all registered. We all have specific locations where we are living, and that is documented. There are limitations to what we can do with the physical environment around us. So how do you see that, that debate in a way?
Yes. Well, thank you for this very good question. I mean, what I think the difference is, so basically, these kind of lines of discipline or control really vary from one camp to another. I mean, from your experience in Palestinian camps, some of them were actually planned in the city to integrate people within Amman, for instance, or other areas. But what I'm trying to kind of like maybe highlight with the disciplinary space of the camp is that the camp and the shelter are made to make, you know, dwelling very difficult. It's made to make inhabiting this place really the most difficult possible. Even with the new designs, even with the, you know, the IKEA design now, they have this kind of big assembled, you know, hut, that's those metallic hut that looks similar to ones that were produced in Azraq camp in a way, but more, you know, Swedish influence. Yeah, I mean, they also somehow limit in many ways people's ability to inhabit the place. And I remember speaking with one of my colleagues who was explained to me that you know, she was going around in one of the camps in Greece, and she was seeing all these cuts in the you know, the structure, people trying to add windows or trying to add other elements. So this kind of disciplinary nature of the shelter, I think it cannot be separated from any shelter or any camp. But what needs to be really given to people is the right to appropriate and say, you have the right to make this place as comfortable as possible for you. And this is a kind of a political statement, although it can make it may be difficult to manage from an urban planning point of view, but I think it is important for refugees at least to have at the very first phases.
Actually, as I was reflecting on that, you know, I worked on Tلبية for a while, and Gaza camp and Husson camp. These are the main camps I worked in. And this is a map of Tلبية in 1987. It's an aerial photo. And you can see how it's so similar to the original plan of الزعتري. And then you see photos like this of the townships in South Africa, apartheid, a similar system of grid, and where people are just, you know, objects placed in this confined space. Some researchers call them undesirables. You know, you push them out of the city. And I was wondering to what extent the professional or the technocrat is actually part of this system of isolation. As urban planners, as people who, social workers, people, all these technical people working in the UN or the humanitarian agencies who are actually creating these spaces. And they are part of this system of isolation and discipline.
Well, I mean, I think one of the important things is to maybe bring more the politics of the architecture and design into our curriculum and our universities. I mean, because I've been asked many times by students, okay, so how can we actually design a better camp? But the question maybe is how not to design camps, you know, that's maybe the question. So one of the guys, you know, I remember speaking to a German student, and he was so enthusiastic about designing a camp and making it better. And I was like, do you want to make another jail? Like, are you sure? Do you understand what this makes? So I think it's you know, important to bring this kind of the politics of architecture. What does it do to people? How does it influence people? And really sensitize the architect and the planner to the limitations of what they do. And also, I mean, here we have, I mean, I have colleagues like who worked with the design of the shelter and Azraq camp and others. And I mean, there is a struggle in the kind of role of architects within these kind of institutions, because I think institutions like humanitarian organizations or other institutions really want to limit people's capacities within this place and to kind of like make them manageable. So in this kind of matrix, the architect is actually, you know, also is in a very tense field of power. And I think, you know, our role is to kind of make people aware about these kind of power relations, make them aware about what the design does, and how can we maybe find ways to resist within the institution, within the arrangement, to, you know, within this kind of context, to kind of humanize whatever we make and allow people to, you know, inhabit the place and appropriate, etc., etc.
It may be also, I think, a matter of standards as well. Because you know, from the other side, we have seen Syrian refugees who choose to leave the city and go into the camp. And earlier, in 1948 and 1967, we also saw Palestinian displaced people and refugees choose to move into the camp. So the camp does offer something to attract people in. So I think, you know, just abolishing the idea altogether may not help, because it creates unnecessary pressure on vulnerable groups. It does offer them kind of a haven for a certain time, but maybe what we need to do is to discuss how it can be more humane in terms of how it's treating people there. I know when we studied, when I was doing my PhD and we were taking classes on emergency management, one of the first rules you memorize is that the emergency camp is supposed to be a place that does not encourage people to stay. So the fact that it's not friendly is actually intentional, because it's supposed to push you out, make you search for other solutions. But then again, when we study all these camps, sometimes, especially in our region, we have protracted emergencies. We have situations where people don't have many options. People are trapped. So, and some of them, I mean, 80%, approximately 80% of refugees, whether Palestinian or Syrian, are outside the camp. They are within the city. They are urban refugees. But there's the most vulnerable 20% move there because, you know, you don't have to worry about rent. There's more assistance. So financially, economically, it works better. But, yes.
It's called the emergency camp because it was established after 67 war. You've seen, I mean, Nablus area,
Yeah, people come together. It's emotional support as well. That's brilliant, actually. Yes, you need to be with people like you. So that's why I'm kind of, you know, wary of not canceling the idea altogether, but maybe being more critical about it. Maybe we can develop another kind of solution, another kind of space, a neighborhood kind of planning, where people can be safe and offered the emotional support that they need. One of the things that really struck me when I was, and probably for architects in this audience, when I saw these maps, and you can see the space here for one of the extended families, true? the one here on the left, and on the right is more of a zoom out, more larger extended family. And you can see the hierarchy of space. You can see the outdoor familial space and courtyards, and the privacy, so several solutions for privacy, which reminded me immediately of these maps by Bianca, who, we teach this for architecture and urban planning students. So you have the general structure of the city on the left, where you have the main street, down here, and then you have the alleys, and this is where an extended clan would live, with families inhabiting spaces, and for each family there's a central courtyard. And if you zoom in, you will see this. This is from Aleppo, where you can see the courtyard as the center. And going back here, I could see the same logical spatial arrangement. The development of public, semi-public, semi-private, and then private, and the significance of the open space as a center for the family, and the relationship between the clusters. And I couldn't but help, if refugees were left alone, they would probably create something similar to this. But the regulations required them to keep distance for different reasons. How well do you think that is playing? I mean, you touched on culture and heritage, but do you see the creation or recreation? You mentioned a hybrid kind of space, but from a spatial structure perspective, I think it's the same spatial structure, although maybe the tectonics are a bit different.
Yes, I mean, totally. I think, so, while I was doing the research, I was like, okay, is this traditional Islamic architecture what we see here? Well, I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but I think, one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning, the kind of visual privacy dimension, which Janet Abul-Lughd wrote about, speaking about the male and female turf, and how, when you go in the old city, you feel that you are entering semi-private space. You have all these things around that makes you feel that you are entering more private area or not. You have these washing lines. You have, in Za'atari camp, you have the water tanks. You have, the stones, how they are arranged. So all these things tells you about that there is a social space happening. So I think that the kind of hierarchy of social space really comes closer, and is the reason why there are similarities between what we see in Za'atari camp and the old city, as you have shown us. And I mean, the question would be is to think, where is social space in our cities today? Maybe that's the question. And how, neoliberalism, the kind of politics, affect the way we are living. In a city like Amman, neighbors barely know each other. Maybe the question is why. If you go to East Amman, of course, there are more connections, there are more, these kind of spaces are also connected to this kind of solidarity support. People know each other, families know each other. So it's a whole different setting. So maybe it's important to think how, economy affects, the fragment, of course, maybe this kind of intensity of social relations, and their spatial, layouts, people wanting to live in villas, wanting to live in separate areas and barely know each other. So, yeah.
Actually, what you just mentioned reminded me of this slide. On the left is the Za'atari plan, and on the right, Za'atari, and on the left, Tلبية. And this is based on the aerial photo and on people's memory, because we don't have an aerial photo from the moment, the initial moment. And in Tلبية, they had rows of houses, of rooms. And it's a very similar story of appropriation and negotiation of space. Although the final result is a bit different, because in the Palestinian camps, first of all, it's been 70 years, more it's more dense.
Yes.
And the space has become limited. So there was a stage where people had courtyards, but then that was closed and they started building more stories because the extended family was going upward. There was no space to go horizontally. And you end with spaces like this. These are pictures from Tarbiyah as well. But the point is, when I saw your diagram over there, and I said, you know, how many years has it been? They're still planning camps in the same way. You have the dwellings, which are rooms, either tent, room, or prefab unit. And then you have collection, all the bathrooms and showers in one area, and the food service in one area, and the water tower. And always there's the management at the entrance of the camp. So it's basically the same thing. Obviously, the decisions are not made by people who are trained in urban design or planning. And from my personal experience, in Jordan at least, the decisions are usually made by engineers doing the infrastructure. And then you have the social workers, but they provide but not the architect who's trained in environmental psychology and in, you know, the importance of social space, etc. So you have this placeless arrangement. Again, going back to, you know, what has changed in more than 70 years of planning?
As you have just summarized, probably not so much. Yeah, I mean, you have the same technocrats somehow doing the same job for the same organizations over and over in different parts of the world. And I mean, I still remember a discussion I had with one of the site planners at UNHCR, and he was explaining to me how, I mean, he was trained in architecture, and he was explaining to me how humiliated he was feeling because his experience was not really taken seriously within the institution. So you have this kind of what's described by Tom Scott Smith as this kind of humanitarian architect divide, right? We have this kind of humanitarian look at architects as people who do luxurious work that's not necessary or unwanted in the context of the humanitarian crisis or work. And you have the architects who come with these kind of all amazing ideas and this kind of creativity that want to contribute to making people's life better. But I mean, I also want to say that from my experience, not all architects' ideas are good. I mean, involving architects not necessarily means that it's good.
Yes, definitely.
You have to have you know, this kind of political understanding, awareness of what's going on. It's also, I came to know that this is very scarce, not as I wish it to be. And yeah, I mean, people, you know, these technocrats still produce these kind of camps without any understanding. I mean, the difference in Tarbiyah is that people were really squeezed in these plots, and they had to really go up. In Zatari camp, this kind of caravan was really interesting because people were really moving. They were putting things in place. The next day, they found them in different areas.
I like that part because we will be enjoying when you read. There are special case studies. So he follows certain people in how they create and I'm reading there, and they're like, yeah, there was this caravan in that corner, and they moved it, and the management, they have no idea what's happening, and the caravans are just disappearing.
Yes.
And people are just creating space, and they're using some of the, you know, the cracks in the system, let's say,
yes,
or the inability to track to their benefit. So they created new spaces.
Yes.
But I was quite amused when they discussed how they got this caravan, they put it apart, create other things from it.
Yeah.
And no one is the wiser. And then you have the UNHCR searching for the
yes.
caravans and no documents on where they are.
Yes.
Quite interesting in how people actually resist control.
Yeah. And actually, this is what makes Zatari camp really like a special case. I mean, people were saying, you know, one of the ladies were telling me, yeah, you can see caravan walking on legs because people took out the structure and they were carrying from inside. I mean, you have all the crazy stuff. People were very creative about really moving things. And not only the arrangement of caravans were disappearing, but also the communal infrastructure, because I remember speaking with the manager of the camp, Kilian Kleinschmidt, back then, who was saying that some of the things that they have constructed completely disappeared the next day. They had to look at the Google Maps and try to convince the donors that they were actually built in this place. So it's really crazy. I mean, it's the transformation that happened in Zatari camp is very much particular to, there was so much energy of actually not caring a lot about, is this the camp or is this the NGOs that are trying to rule us? We don't care. Let's
we do it our way.
Let's do it our way. Yeah. Let's show them how it's done. So that's basically what happened. Yeah.
And I think that also brings the economic empowerment aspect, in that within the camp you have this relationship with the refugee that you're supposed to be receiving at the receiving end, and also the discussion about how the refugees flipped that, and they started producing and selling, and they became more of quasi-entrepreneurs within the space of the camp, empowering themselves through varied modes of buying and selling, which reminded me in a way of things I saw in several camps. I remember in one of the camps, the DPA, or the government representative, I saw this older lady. This was like 10 years ago. And she had a cell phone. And he was like, this is a woman who was supposed to be extremely, extremely poor. And he's like, she has a cell phone. And I'm like, what's the problem? She's not supposed to be able to afford that. So, and I'm looking at him and I'm wondering, and he said, you know what these people do? They sell the rations. She receives rations, aid, food aid. So what she does is she takes a little bit of it and she sells some. And for the government employees, that's a problem. It worries them that maybe she's getting more than what she's supposed to be getting, or she's not supposed to do that. But in reality, this is how she is enabling herself to lead a better life, because you need more than just food. And this is how she got her cell phone. This is how she pays for some of the things in her house. And I think this also works in the black market that takes place within camps. So legally, as a refugee, you don't own the plot of land in a Palestinian refugee camp, but people sell. And in Zatari, I think something similar was happening.
Yes, I mean, definitely. So the economic dynamics were really interesting in the camp. So first, people were giving these kind of like weekly, I think 2 weeks ratio, like about 15 JDs maybe, if I remember correctly. And people were very disappointed. I think one of the interesting parts is people were actually comparing food in Jordan to what they used to have in Syria. So they were really all the time like, claiming it's not so good because they were introduced to frozen chicken and stuff like that, which for some people was new. So they were actually circulating these kind of small pieces of aid and trying to kind of make business out of it, try to bring new
options that are more relevant to them.
Yes, and also create new markets. And the interesting thing about what you said about the emergence of these kind of markets, because some of the dwellings were actually sold by others for 3,000 JDs or 6,000. People were actually, they had money, of course, and the idea of refugee as a victim is today is still, it's strange that many humanitarian actors still think about refugees like that, because some of them come from a privileged, background. Some of them, as I said in the book, some of them come from dwellings where they were inhabited 200 years ago. Some of them were living in old Damascus or other places. They are not all coming from rural areas. So many of them struggled to live in a tent or a caravan. They were like, this is not, we don't know how to deal with this, And for humanitarian actors, people had to abide to this, and they had to abide to the economic law that they introduced, which is like, this is how, you receive this, you spend it on that, and that's it. And people were not happy with that. And this is how, all these kind of different layers of people, especially the caravan realtors who were, working with this business, I think they were making lots of money because many people relied on the caravan to make, the dwellings. and they were saving some and became experts in dismantling and arranging the caravan, and a whole new business emerged out of nothing in the camp. So it's interesting to see how these kind of economic cycles are completely disrupted, mostly in the camps, and then new forms of connections emerge.
I think that also helps us explain or understand, in Amman, the main hubs for retail and sometimes even wholesale, you'll find in Wahdat or you'll find in Jabal Hussein. And these were initiated initially by refugees and within refugee camps. So you have this ability of being creative in a way and taking risk, and also this not accepting being a victim.
Yes.
They are not victims, definitely. They create solutions. I remember one of the refugees, I was doing research a few years ago with my colleague, Dr. Beverly Butler, and some of these drawings we did together, some pictures. And we were discussing with refugees in 5 different camps in Amman, Jordan, one of the what is the heritage of a refugee in the broader sense. And one of the themes that emerged was, this being resilient and creative. And when ما بتنزل تنزل واقف, you would say that, nothing can break you. And you constantly have ideas, and you can adjust to the circumstances, and you create solutions. And talking about that, if you remember when we did that workshop in Husn camp, and we had this 2 universities coming into, not Husn camp, Gaza camp,
Yeah.
which is Jarash camp. And we had all these ideas of sustainable solutions, green solutions. And we go into the camp and we partner with a local NGO, and everything we had in mind, they already tried it.
Yes.
And they gave us feedback about the positives and negatives and the cost and the risks and etc. And we were forced to rethink what we had in mind and work with them to develop some new ideas. So I agree again, this idea of the refugee as victim is really flawed, but it's constantly being propagated by NGOs, unfortunately.
Yeah. We need to document how creative refugees are. Also this kind of creativity comes again with the idea of the dwelling, to come back to the book, that the Heidegger says that a dweller is actually a creative person. You have to be creative to dwell. It's not like you just put your luggage and that's it. You have to make something that fits with your life. And I think all these kind of economic or spatial aspects all come back to this point that refugees are creative at the end of the day. They're not like victims, and we need to acknowledge that. Yes.
Speaking of creativity, this is a slide I gathered from some pictures. These are people trying, when I saw some of these slides you showed about how people were creating interesting open space, but in some of the camps they don't have, the Palestinian camps is very cramped, so they don't always have that. So you go out into the alley, and these are alleys where people are using them as a social family space. I don't know, this doesn't show much, but underneath this vine there's a sitting area in the alley, and sometimes people use blankets, and that blanket has a meaning. When you see the blanket, it means you're not supposed to find a different alley to go through. They are claiming the alley for a temporary period of time. And different kinds of arrangements within the alleys that tell you how people are creatively using the space, which also brings to mind the symbology of the material and the space for refugees. What a blanket means, what that step of a mastabe means, what that shelter means, the zinc and what it means, and all relate. I found parallels with what's you're showing in Za'tari, but in a different way, because the social or the physical is different. This is a space that's supposed to be a circulation space. these are alleys where people walk, but they are becoming temporary living rooms, outdoor courtyards and living rooms.
Yeah, this is somehow looks, I mean, completely similar to what's happening in Za'atari camp and to, you know, I mean, all these kind of experiences we had together in different refugee camps and Palestinian camps. I mean, they had a lot to you know, they really enabled me to reflect a lot on what I had here in this book. So, you know, people's need to kind of create these social spaces, as you said, very dynamic, very multifaceted. They sometimes temporary. They change over time, over the day, you know, daytime. So it's something that I think we really need to learn from in our cities, how creative people can be in camps, and you know how these kind of small acts of appropriations can be so empowering and so symbolic and meaningful to these people, and we need to maybe as architects appreciate them more, I think.
Yeah. This actually reminds me of something you mentioned in the book about the meaning of material, and there's a parallel in Palestinian camps as well. You know, stone is not permitted in Palestinian camps. Stone it has meaning. Zinco has meaning. You know, when you talk to a Palestinian refugee,
Yes.
zinco or zinc sheets, they have a meaning. The blankets or the mushamma
أيوة.
in Za'tari has meaning. Trees have meaning for, you know, maybe for the sovereign that is different from the refugee. If you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as I said before, all these kind of materials had a political meaning in the camp. I think it's interesting to see how they became articulated on the idea of temporariness, what is temporary and what's not. And this kind of created dilemma of, you know, how do we categorize these materials? How do we make this temporary or not? Is it okay to kind of make a cement step like, you know, 1 meter high or half a meter? So these kind of issues allows us to see this kind of silhouette or boundaries of temporariness, how it also changes over time. Because, for example, in Wahdat camp or in Hussein camp or all Palestinian camps, you know, these boundaries have shifted. You know, they were not allowed. You know, even in a camp like Jarash, people are not allowed to actually build with concrete or cement structures. So you have a high percentage of dwellings with zinco roofings like this one. In the middle. And I mean, it's interesting to see how refugees push these boundaries, how they claim slowly these kind of spaces, this kind of materiality, this kind of practicing of politics, very interesting. And eventually, as you said, also the idea of the trees and planting for Syrian refugees was major importance, because they used to live in a very green environment almost, you know, in comparison to the region in Mafraq. And interesting to see that, you know, plants are not allowed, you know, trees are not allowed to be planted in the camp because they have these signs of
roots and permanence.
Yes, permanency. However, you can see that people are planting inside the dwellings, and the trees are going up, you know, from the courts. And so it's an interesting dynamic we will have to see in the next years, obviously.
I want to reduce the number of comments I have, and probably open the floor for some people. I can see some eyes there. They want to have some additions. I would like to thank you very much for a very interesting book. I enjoyed reading it. I'm sure everybody will enjoy reading it, because you have layers of discussion in the book that will relate to different people. And whether it's the details of the case studies of individuals and how they built their homes, or the discussion of the meaning of a camp and what a camp is, generally it will provoke a thoughtful discussion. The book can be downloaded, PDF.
Yes.
Do you
exactly? Yeah, I mean, we can show it here. So you can, I mean, if you want to download the book, it's here on the website of Transcript, the publisher. You can go to the PDF, you can download it. And I mean, we have here, as I said, 10 copies. If you want to buy it, it's an author price, so it's reduced to 22 JDs if you want. There's only 10 copies by Ahmad if you want.
A signed copy.
Signed copy if you want.
You want one? Romola is already asking for one. Yeah, sure. Sure.
Hello, thank you so much for your really interesting talk and the dialogue afterwards. I had a question about this idea that the Zatari camp is supposed to be been able to be deconstructed in 24 hours, and that was like a really critical component when they were building it. Do you feel that this idea of this immediate destruction when it's safe to go back home eventually plays into the mindset of people with their determinants and resistance, maybe by using the structures in a way that kind of goes against this idea in the forefront or in the background? Or do you think that this isn't really actually true or like playing an important part in the camp design and setting?
Do you mean in Zatari camp or in general?
In Zatari camp
Okay.
specifically.
Yes, okay, thank you so much for the question. Well, I mean, I don't recall that they had this idea. I mean, you know, in the planning of camps, they usually try to push this idea forward that these camps have always to be dismantled quickly as possible whenever people can, you know, there's a chance that they can return. But I don't think this, I mean, in my experience, this has, you know, very rarely happened. So, and then I don't think in Zatari camp that was the case. It was more of a, maybe more of a chaos, like, you know, people were coming, you know, this kind of major influx of people to the camp overnight was very influential. And the humanitarian organization, UNHCR, was almost reactionary all the time. So I don't think they were really planning ahead that much to say, okay, now we will dismantle the camp. I mean, of course, this probably, you know, appears in the background, you know, on the backdrop of how things are planned or whatever, but I don't think it played a role in how people actually reacted to the camp or how they kind of like dealt with the structure of the camp.
Thank you.
Thank you.
يعطيكم العافية. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and the dialogue and what seems promising to be a very interesting read. Actually, I was wondering if you think that the refugees, by dismantling the machine that was designed to inhabit them for a certain while, are they practicing a kind of a healing process that might keep them insane, that can keep them mentally well for a while in order to be able to live as a decent human being? And the other point is it refers to what Dr. Fatima first started with, and that's the decolonization of knowledge. I mean, your book is very important because it provides a perspective from within. It is done by a refugee, maybe someone who has experienced it in many levels. But this makes me think that if you have done your PhD sponsored by a local university, or would you be able to have the accessibility to the Za'atari camp or any other camp? Would you be able to do it the same way that you have done it by being sponsored by a foreigner? I mean, I'm totally into decolonizing knowledge, and I do appreciate the book and your effort. It's amazing. But it also makes me reflect on how much we still rely on the West or the foreigner in order to provide us with accessibility to our own places, especially the camps.
Wow,
thank you
so much. These are two amazing questions, really. I thank you for asking them. Well, the first question, that's really, there's a lot to reflect on here. I mean, as you said, the idea of dismantling had a lot to do with the psychological well-being. I remember, you know, the first visits to the camp, people were immediately painting on these shelters, on these caravans, on the, you know, they're making all these beautiful images of oases or trees or anything that really breaks at least visually, breaks this kind of connection with this as a shelter. They were also, in a way or another, by doing that, also dismantling this kind of structure and giving it a different meaning, humanizing it if you want. Or people there was some guy who was a civil engineer was like, yeah, these communal latrines, they don't work like this. We don't know what is for females or what's for male. We have to paint it, and I want to go and paint and all this kind of stuff. So this kind of like approach to the machine, if you want, they were not afraid of it. They were like saying, okay, we want to do whatever what fits for us at this moment of time. And I think this had a lot of good implication on people, psychologically speaking, making them feel in a way, I wouldn't say at home, but like not alienated from the context, which is something, of course, happened in also different examples. I think if you look at this relationship, there are, of course, many examples to give. In regard to the second question, wow, that's really a good one. Well, I think if I was giving funding to do research from here, how things would be. I mean, of course, it will be different. I should acknowledge that I have received lots. I was really privileged when I was doing this PhD. I was very privileged of being part of this collaborative research center in Berlin, which has received one of the biggest funding in Germany. I was able to do traveling, produce a film, make exhibitions. That was, I think, it's a huge privilege to have. But I mean, I think, when you have this kind of with so much power, there's so much responsibility. And I think when I was writing these kind of words, there were lots of tensions with all the people I work with. There was tensions with the people in the workplace. There were fights within the environment. I think if I would have done it in here, maybe things would be easier. But there, it was also much more difficult to say these words. It wasn't as easy as it sounds. And I mean, many people were even telling me, I mean, colleagues from our department coming from Latin America and saying, wow, Ayhem, this is so courageous that you said this. And I was like, everyone should be saying that, not only me. So, I mean, I understand people's approach to, as you said, decolonization of knowledge might be different. They take different routes. There are different occasions where they actually try to claim, knowledge in different ways. But it wasn't easy, and I think, yeah, it wasn't easy because I was also privileged in some way. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, this reminds me of something that a PhD student currently in Europe the other day tweeted about, and she's an acquaintance, and I follow on what she's doing. She's working in camps, and she constantly tweets about the difficulties she's facing with her supervisor. So one thing I remember is how many times she's discussing Wahdat camp, and he constantly tells her that he's not interested in the social aspect or the historical aspect or the economic aspect. He wants her to focus. She's an architect, so he wants her to focus on the physical only. And she was having difficulty explaining to him why that should not be done. So I think, some people's, the difficulty of working outside is that they don't understand the context, maybe.
Thank you very much for a great job done.
Thank you.
And the most interesting thing in my point of view is the title of your dissertation, Shelters to Dwellings. Speaking of shelters, it's mainly the UNHCR, the doer, mainly the UN and NGOs, where they design the whole setting according to their thinking of a camp, while the dwelling, it's about the people, about the history of people. And you saw it in Za'atari camp and in the refugee camps here in Jordan, while you see the history of people and the way they develop their environment in a way to suit their case. And most of the cases, refugees take long time to be resettled, or whatever, like the Palestinian cause still standing, I don't know until when. But then with the relation between the doer, the UN, and the refugees, I believe it's the main obstacle for refugees to have their proper dwelling. Meaning when UNRWA, after so many years, decided to create something called camp improvement and infrastructure, where lots of suspicion and the lots of, you know, they throwing the conspiracy theory around this. And I don't exempt them from this, by the way, but still thinking of refugees as human beings. Before anything, they are human beings. So they have the right of living in dignity. Like in Lebanon, it's very unhuman conditions for refugees, and it has been there, they have been there for ages and never had a proper chance of living like other people, other citizens. So my point is, did you see any kind of roster plan? Because the most recent refugee camp is the Za'tari in our region. Did you see any roster plan for the proper development of the camp? Because you see each of the UN agencies or NGOs stepping in with their funds and doing their own, implementing their own projects without having, you know, a roster plan that who fits within a master plan like what you did in Talbiya and in Jarash camp and elsewhere. And the other biggest challenge is to what extent they have respect to the refugees. They call participation of refugees in the design of their shelters, in the improvement of their shelters, but it's never there, just slogans, rhetorics, that it's trendy, and until a proper political will to change the life of refugees, a chronic problem will continue to exist.
Well, I mean, this is a tough question. Well, I mean, even if they had, so having plans is something, and what happens on the ground is really something else. The thing with the UN organizations is that they always have these kind of visions. I think they are all the time depending on funding. Like, I mean, the idea of the IKEA shelter, this new shelter, I was speaking with Kilian Kleinschmidt, and he was saying that IKEA, they were you know, suggesting that to give, I don't know how many millions for UNHCR to develop this model. Wasn't that UNHCR was really interested in how people live or how to develop the shelter. They were not really interested. I mean, they were interested in the money, basically. So this is what happened. They were like, okay, let's do this kind of collaboration together, and let's develop this model, and then we have this kind of newly packed, you know, shelters that look like a, you know, like a box like this that can be shipped everywhere around the world, etc., etc. So I believe that you know, UN organizations might have good intentions from, you know, every now and then, but the institution itself is not, you know, these kind of organizations really, they want to keep people managed in a way. That's the issue. And when people want to claim things, on the one hand, it gets problematic. Also, on the other hand, what Dr. Fatma did in Talbiya camp and other camps that showed us that people can actually reject these plans and maybe go against what UNHCR wants to, or UN organizations want to do, even if it was participatory planning. So it's very complex, and yeah, I'm not sure if this participatory planning, I don't know if it can be good.
It's a difficult question, and in your question, because you were with us when we worked in Talbiya and Husn camps, and you witnessed some of the difficulties, but you saw the difficulties in the institution. So the institution had difficulty accepting the refugee as a partner. And many of the people working in the institution felt that, you know, this should not be happening because you're giving voice. I mean, it's not like they didn't want voice to the refugee, but they were worried about hijacking the participatory process by the powerful and jeopardizing the needs of the elite, the vulnerable, who usually don't have a voice. Of course, there are tools of how to manage that, but you are talking to people who, you know, they are tired of the pressure of working with the local community, which is not easy, by the way. And when we often talk about local community or refugees, I mean, they're not all similar. You have different groups with different agendas and different needs, and you have this problem of how to reach consensus, if you ever can reach consensus. And the practical aspect of how that is difficult, that's why many of the agencies, they opt for tokenistic participation. Because they don't want the trouble that comes with real participation. So it becomes tokenistic, and the refugees are there. They listen to them, but then they do what they want. And that's a reality. And then you have on the other side, what you also discussed is the refugee being suspicious of what the agency is doing, and not, this lack of trust, especially in the case of Palestinian refugees, because they're always worried about the right of return, and what's being plotted about our right of return, and are they trying to settle us here? And that was also another problem we always faced when we were trying to improve the camp. And I think it's a dilemma that needs to be tackled, separately. I don't think we can have a big answer for it, but yeah, that was a good question, provoking.
Maybe just an add up to this. It's interesting also to see that people, their approach to this kind of political dilemma is always different. In the case of Palestinian refugee camps, people were arguing against, the rehabilitation of the camp because they thought it's against their right to return, right? I don't think this might be not the same with Zatari or with the Syrian case. So it's always different how people approach these issues and how they play, in politics within this matrix of power relations.
Yalla, the last two questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ayhem and Dr. Fatma. I want to ask a question about you focused on your book about, on the dwellings, or from shelters to dwellings. What about the infrastructure of the camp and the public services for the refugees done within the camp? Did you mention that in your book? And another comment about what are the similarities between Zatari camp and Syrian refugee camps in Europe, for example, or in Turkey? Are there similarities, or Zatari is a unique case? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very interesting questions. So, about public services, I think of course there are public services. There are many schools, there are many hospitals, there are many public spaces. There's this kind of Champs-Élysées, the souk, which is also very interesting part of the camp, very vibrant. There are many facilities, and it's interesting to see how people were reacting to this. I think what really struck me when I was visiting the camp first time is that all these fenced infrastructures, I thought it was really interesting. The community center was really just fenced tent out in the nowhere. So when I spoke with people, when the planners of the camp, they were like, yeah, of course, if we don't fence it, it's gone the next day. So it's interesting here to ask ourselves about how imposed these infrastructures are on people, and how necessary are they for this community, and whether they have alternatives for that. Interesting to see now in Zatari, for example, now that many refugees have, there are all these kind of playgrounds emerging around the periphery of the camp. People speak proudly about it, like, yeah, come in spring and see how we're playing in matches. And I mean, they're not using the ones by UNHCR. I mean, of course, some of them are using them, but it's interesting to see their alternative approach to infrastructure. Also, the Madafa, I didn't talk about this, the emergence of the Madafa, which is the hospitality space in different parts of the camp. I mean, here you can see it also, if you want, within the cluster, this part here. I mean, people were producing their own infrastructure within the camp. So this is something interesting to look at. Regarding the second question was similarities. Yes. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the book, I try to say that, based on my experience, it seems that this kind of dismantling, reassembling is an reoccurrence process. It happened also in other camps. So, for example, in Berlin, they had all these kind of container units. So you have a container, like unit like this, one caravan here for sleeping 2 persons, another here for 2 persons, one shared with like a kitchenette and a bathroom. And people struggle with the regulations because the management of the camp says you cannot take furniture outside. You cannot plant trees here in front of the window because it's an escape route. You cannot do whatever. And of course, people find very interesting ways to go around this, because whenever I was visiting with the manager of the camp, and she was really very, very afraid that I noticed all the things, and people were putting beds on the top the caravan, so they hide it, or they dismantle the bed and put it somewhere else, or create small gardens, but negotiate with the management that this is not so high, it's okay, we can escape, and all that. So of course, the similarity is this kind of appropriation, this kind of act of claiming, of making politics within a context where you're not supposed to make politics, where you're supposed to be just recipient of aid and just do whatever we tell you. You sleep here, you eat here, you go out, you finish, that's it. So yeah, I think this kind of resistance through dwelling is what is similar, and in the both contexts, of course, different boundaries, but always interesting to compare.
Thank you both, first of all. I want to ask about a point you just brought up about appropriation. So in the book, you mentioned something about, you kind of warn or kind of make a note about how, also that you don't want to romanticize appropriation. So I was just curious if you could say more about what you meant by that, and like, are there risks of thinking that all appropriation is great? And then on that point as well, what do you think it would take, without romanticizing it, what would it take to have UNHCR and government adopt this idea of the right to appropriate? Have you tried? I don't know if you've tried talking to them.
Yes, thank you so much, Roa. Very good question. So the first one, what was it about? Oh my God. Yes, romanticize. Yes, I'm sorry. It's getting late. Yeah, obviously. About not romanticizing. Yes, I mean this I've seen a lot in Zatari camp and also in other camps in Europe. When mostly scholars from the West, or they go to the camp and they're like, oh my God, they have a fountain in the middle of the desert, and it's like great, and it's like so amazing, and some people did this and did that. I mean, the romanticization come with the idea that these appropriations are so great, and they are overloaded sometimes. That look, I mean, Syrians are having their best time in their life. They have a fountain and they have a shop and all that. So I think it depends how they use, how they articulate, how they show these kind of appropriation, in which context, how is it being displayed to the public, or even this happens also in Germany when students go on like, oh my God, refugees, they want to sit on the ground. This is their first time, sitting on table. It's amazing. You have all these weird stories of people coming telling you, oh yeah, you are used to sitting on the ground. That's how we know you. I don't know where they got. Like this is what I'm saying about romanticizing appropriations and thinking of them as maybe stereotyping people also, which is not true. And the second question about making UN organizations and governments adopting this right to appropriate, this is really tricky. As we were having this discussion at Makana, the other day, the guy was saying, الحق ينتزع انتزاع شو ما هيك حكى فانه what's your own, but the right is taken by force somehow. So I think these kind of appropriations are also a way to take what's your right, which is the right to dwell, which is the right to settle somewhere. And you do this through appropriations, and I think it would be also romantic to say, oh yeah, the UN organizations or governments will actually accept refugees doing that. It's always this kind of negotiations and push and pull.
I think that relates to the question that where to work with UN organizations or the humanitarian on trying to find a solution or trying to organize appropriation requires a participatory platform. And I think that's where Maha was going when she was talking about, working with the refugees so that you try to work together towards improving the physical setting or the socioeconomic setting. But then again, here we go back to the issue of the problems of participation and some people hijacking the process to their ends. And the resource, scarcity of resources makes it very difficult for the employees themselves. So that's why eventually, even in in the perfect world where we agree to do that, what happens is that gradually the employees will start withdrawing, and it becomes more tokenistic. And I can, if you don't mind, I can give you an example where when we started working on camp improvement, we recommended a participatory approach for developing the shelters. or the dwellings, you know. And the first camp, we implemented that in Tلبية. And when I was there, we worked, we did a few focus groups with the community and to see what options there might be for improving the shelter without, you know, crossing the boundaries of what the DPA wants and what UNRWA wants, etc. But the most important issue was that the improvement of the shelter needs to be with the residents. Now, the last time I visited, which was probably 9 months ago, and I was talking to people about what happened. Now, in theory, it's participatory. But what happens when you talk to the people is that the architects and engineers, basically, they are engineers. They bring the shelter plan, and the local wants to make changes. And they go, yeah, sure, this process is participatory. You can make the changes, but that will delay your application. And I don't know about the funding, and I don't know if it's going to be there later on. So they approve what's there. So that goes for, you know, participation.